Yes. Okay. So, okay, let's go back to where we were, okay? The question was, had you ever had a situation where you felt that you were being assessed for something that wasn't necessarily taught? I use the example of one of my kids who needed to know their lab partners, and they lost points for not knowing the lab partners, okay? It was never taught who the lab partners were. It was never a skill that was developed. It was never one of the end goals for the class. So to take points off for that was unfair, right? But it happens a lot, because oftentimes people building assessments are just building it off of the top of their heads, or saying, okay, well, here's what we have for your questions. Here's what you need to do to prove that you know you're learning. But what we forget is that if we do not align it with our objectives, we can solve this in two ways. We can build in an objective and then teach for it, or we can take it out of our scoring. Those are our only two choices. So we're going to talk a little bit about what that means, and I'm going to show you some examples today that I hope will help you get your head around it. When I do assessment with my teacher education candidates and my own students back home, we take a lot of time on assessment. We circle back around to it. We have at least 3 or 4 days built into the curriculum. So this is a mini version to help you just kind of think a little bit about what it means. And again, remember the meta level. You all have been assessed all of your lives. We all have been, for all sorts of things, okay? The best assessments are the ones that assess on the standards that we have been guided to learn. So let's get ourselves around that. The other thing that we're going to talk about today, and I will show you some examples of rubrics. Now, rubrics may be a new term to you. It may be a very old term. It may be a term you've known all of your life in schooling. That's fine. Rubrics can have lots of different definitions, so we'll make sure we're all on the same page about what I mean when I say rubric. When I first started going into teaching, we were not using rubrics. They weren't really a common term. And now it's a very common term in education to think about using a rubric. We're going to look at some examples. And then the standard-based learning, we're also going to look at some examples, which is just what I said. We have standards. We base all of our teaching and learning on those standards. Those standards drive everything. And if I am veering from that, then I need to either reassess the standard or reassess the pathway to get there. And again, I'm going to show you some graphic organizers, we call them, some charts. And then the last thing I want to think about briefly here, and again, I don't have time to kind of put this up like on a chalkboard or on a slide, but basically, I want you to think about what we call the toxic zero. Now, I understand that context is everything. You all have a slightly different point system for how you get scored on things, okay? So I don't want to go down a rabbit hole that is not relevant to you. What I will tell you is that in some instances, and I assume that may also be true here, but I know not to assume, we often, at least in the American system, base it on a 100-point system. So it's a percentage, okay? So you might get an 80% on something or an 85% on something. Now, I know for you all, like with the assessments we did yesterday, you had 25 points and you get so many out of 25. I don't know what happens with that 21 out of 25. I don't know if it gets converted to a percentage. I don't know whether or not it gets added in to create something that equals 100 that ends up being a percentage. So I want you to bear with me on this a little bit, because this is actually just a math problem, okay? Mathematically, when we talk about, and I'm going to talk about it in the US context, if I have a 100-point system, it's very, very common in US schools all the way up through graduate school and beyond, that we give a percentage. And we often will give a test that has, let's say it has 25 points on it, and you got a 21 out of 25, and then I convert that to be a percentage, okay? Mathematically, just mathematically, all you need to know is basic math, okay? When I have a smaller number of items on a test, each item becomes magnified for its worth. That's just basic math. You all with me on this, right? If I have 5 items on a test and I'm converting to a percentage, you miss one and you're down a lot of points. The more items I have, if I had 100 items on that test and you miss one, you're only at a 99%, right? Okay. In the United States, the system goes like this. You have an A range, which is like 90 to 100 typically. It doesn't have to be exactly that. You have a B range, which is about 80 to 90. You have a C range, which is about 70 to 80. You have a D range, which is about 60 to 70. And then you fail. You have an F. And an F is below 60, which is a full range of 60 points. So if you never submit an assignment, or if you just don't do a homework assignment one day, or several days maybe, and I put a 0 into a score sheet for you, what I've done mathematically is to completely obliterate and completely downward trend your grade, okay? A failure is 60 full points. Passing is actually only 40 points. So to put a 0 in, I call it the toxic, I didn't create that term, the toxic 0. All you need to do is Google the toxic 0 in education. What you'll find is that we do this all the time in classes. I've advocated many times for students. One of my points of advocacy is that if someone doesn't hand something in, you don't put a 0 in, you put a 50 in. Because it keeps your scale, right? So I've got, it's only another 10 points down to get a 50. Okay. Mathematically speaking, it makes a lot more sense to put a 50 in for a missing paper than a 0. And anything below a 50 is also going to, so if somebody gets a 34%, I would put that in as a 50. Somebody gets a 47%, I'd put it in as a 50, okay? There is no really good way to recover from anything below a 50 because it distorts the scale, okay? And again, you can play around with the numbers. When I teach my teacher ed candidates back home, we play around with the numbers. We pretend. We say, okay, you got this on this assignment, and we play around with those numbers and see what happens, okay? So that's point number 1, toxic 0, we don't want. I had a student this past term, a college student, who did not submit an assignment. And I gave several reminders. So, well, it's late. Okay, and even late points, right? Well, you're losing 5 points a day. Well, I don't tend to say that. What I say is you have until 2 days from now, and the highest mark you can get would be a B on it or something like that. Well, this student did not complete the assignment. I will not put in a 0. Again, I will put a 50% in, but that student did really well on all the rest of their work. Okay? There's a big difference between not knowing anything at all and not handing it in. So I have advocated for children and youth many times where I've sat at meetings as the advocate, and a teacher has said, well, she's failing right now. And I always ask this, is that student failing because she doesn't know the material, or is she failing because she hasn't submitted the work? Those are radically different questions, right? If you're failing because you don't know the material, you need those interventions and the scaffolds to learn the material and get your work done. What is one of our fight or flight strategies? Don't do the work. It's too much for me. I'm overwhelmed. I'm just going to ignore it. Okay, ignoring it is actually a very common thing to do. We just ignore it. It's too hard. We don't want to face it. Okay? That's a very different matter from, I know I just didn't have it, or I don't know, I lost it in the bottom of my backpack. I thought I had done it, but I didn't. Or, oh, I was sick for a few days. Can I, whatever. So there's a big difference between not having done it and not knowing the material. How we react to that, that's our very first question we should always ask if somebody is failing. Okay. And again, I understand your system may be slightly different, but you can still use the information, right? I mean, there's a difference between not knowing and not doing. Okay, so that's one thing we want to think about in assessment. Think about this for a minute. Okay, so we need to build assessments that are fair. We want to build assessments that are equitable. We want to build assessments that assess what we say they're supposed to assess. And we also want to be careful about whatever grading scheme we use, whatever grading scheme we use. If we're using 21 out of 25, my question is, what does that mean? Is there a cutoff grade where you all of a sudden don't get credits for something? I don't know. Okay, and I can talk with Shivani ma'am more about that and find out what happens. But that would be my concern. Did anybody, for example, get a 12 out of 25? And then what does that mean? Right? I just don't know. I don't know what that means. Okay. So our 100-point system is flawed, but it's flawed in another way as well. And very often, let's take a different system, which is very similar. It's based on the 100-point system, but the system goes like this. You get an A, a B, a C, a D, or an F. So same system is all laid out there, okay, with my 100 points or whatever I have it. Now I'm grading a paper, and I very often say, oh, I don't put a 92 or a 93. I say, this is an A paper. This is a B minus. Now, I have taught for many, many, many thousands of years, okay? And 1,000 years ago, when I was first starting my teaching career, I didn't really know what an A felt like or a B felt like. But after 40 years in the business or more, I have a pretty good idea of what an A, a B, a C, and a D look like and feel like and sense like. However, if you were to come up to me and say, why did I get a C? And my answer to you is, it felt like a C. It's a little C-ish today. You would say to me, what are you talking about? It felt like a C. I say, yeah, just kind of like, you're not really beyond a C, I don't think. And you're going to say, that's so unfair. But the other thing that's really unfair about that is I might sort of feel like you're a C because you gave me some troubles. And I don't mean to hold it against you, but it kind of feels C-ish in my mind because I'm really fed up with the troubles you've given me. But I don't mean it to be unfair. I'm not an unfair person. All I mean is that you weren't here a lot of days. It's C-ish. You know, you did this or that. Oh, that's kind of a C-ish range. When I'm doing this kind of ish, I've got a problem. The problem is that everything relies on what I'm feeling in that moment, in that day. Maybe I can say, oh, I've done this for many years. I trust my expertise. Well, if I trust my expertise that much, then maybe I should have some pretty clear criteria, and I should be able to say to you, where did my C come from? And I can now say, here's the criteria, here's where you met it, and here's where you didn't. And we can talk about that, okay? So I bet all of us in this room have had experiences where we've received a mark, we call them grades, we receive a mark or a grade on something, and we've questioned it. Maybe we have felt that it wasn't fair. Maybe we have felt that it missed something we actually meant to say, or that we did say and the teacher missed it, okay? Maybe we felt that the teacher was doing something hastily in marking that. So I bet most of us have had circumstances where we felt that something was unfair in a grade. I pray that has not been an experience for you, but it certainly has been an experience for me. We hold on to those times. Like, I can remember times, in like high school, second round, that teacher didn't give me that mark for, I hold on to it. Why am I holding on to it? Because it felt so unfair to me who had worked so hard, right? Okay, so that means that when we give these A, B, C, D marks, or whatever it is that we give, 21, whatever, we had marks very clearly set on those papers we gave you yesterday, 3 points each, and we knew in our heads, and if you ask me, where did I lose a point or two, I can tell you exactly where, because we had 3 points. If we had 10 points per question, it's going to be a lot harder for me to tell you why you got a 7 instead of a 6, right? If I have 20 points per answer, it's going to be impossible. You're going to say, why did you give me a 15 and not a 16? It just felt like a 15 and not a 16, right? So very often when I'm working with teachers and teachers-to-be, they will have checklists or rubrics or situations where they'll say, each item is worth 10 points. And I say, if you were in a court of law, can you tell me the difference between a 6 and a 7 on that scale? Chances are highly unlikely, okay? What if you lose 5 points for not having your lab partners listed? That's an all or nothing. You just are down 5, okay? Maybe if you list 2 of your partners, you get 2 points, whatever. But generally speaking, there are a lot of the times that we call it an all or nothing score. I'm trying to explain to you that very often assessment ends up being subjective. And it's subjective in ways that can actually really harm students in front of us. And if we believe anything about this week, we believe that we need to set up fair systems and just systems for all of our students, okay? So let's go and think about, and the other thing that I've noticed is this, that have you ever had a situation where you might have, let's say either at the college level or secondary level particularly, where you know you have, there are 2 classes that are offered in something and you get one teacher or another teacher. You say, I really hope I get that teacher because that teacher's an easier grader. Or I hope I get that teacher because that teacher gives a lot of A's or whatever it is your system is, right? Or I don't want that teacher because that teacher doesn't believe in giving A's or whatever it is, okay? What you're saying every time you say things like that is how arbitrary the system is. It shouldn't have anything to do with whether somebody gives A's or doesn't give A's or is a harder or easier grader. It shouldn't matter. What should matter is, did I set the standards? Am I assessing for the standards? And are my marks aligned with setting those standards? That's the only thing that should matter. So that teacher A and teacher B, if they're both teaching math, should have very similar grading schemas that they end up with, okay? However, we know that's not often the case. So I want people that I'm working with, say back home or with you all, to go out there and say, I don't want to be that teacher that just goes, it just felt kind of like this. Well, I don't know, I sort of feel like, and I may be justified in saying that with all of my years of experience, but you're not inside my head. So you can't plug in and say, oh yeah, I get it, all of your years of experience. What I can say is I can point to this. So I'm going to show you some examples of that. Now up here I have an acronym that's very often used to set what are our objectives and our goals, okay? And I don't know if you can read this very clearly, so I'll read it for you. They're called SMART goals. So when we set a goal for somebody, is it specific? Meaning something like, not just that your attendance is good, but that you will be, and I think some of you told me you have attendance rate, like you're supposed to be 70%, right? So that's specific. You have an exact number. Now you can play that game, you can play those marks about when you show up or don't, but the more specific I can be about a target. So let's say I want somebody to know math and I say you need to be able to get a certain mark in that, or instead of saying I want you all to be good people, maybe instead I say I want to see 3 examples of you being good, kind to somebody. Okay, so specific. And then M, measurable. What is M? I can't read that, but it's measurable. So in other words, I need to be able to measure that goal. So if it's not measurable, I shouldn't include it. So can I say you will know 3 causes of such and such war? That's measurable. If I just say to you, just know some causes of the war, that's not measurable, okay? It should be achievable, which means that if I set something that's really out of the realm for some of my students, I've gone above the ZPD, and that's very unfair. There are times, again, that you've had things on a test that some people know and some didn't. Yesterday, somebody said, but the psych students may have an advantage over knowing some information. So if you put something on your test yesterday that was information we didn't cover in class, I wouldn't necessarily count that, because that's not, is that fair to everybody that you knew something that somebody else didn't? Not really, because it wasn't teachable, it wasn't taught, right? It's not that you did a bad thing, you might have gone above and beyond, but is it achievable by everyone in the room, and did I actually teach towards it? Because if you're just coming out with stuff that you know, that's great, I appreciate that you know it, but I shouldn't assess in that way for it. Is it relevant? And again, that's where we talk about things like, is knowing your lab partners relevant to your score on a chemistry lab? Now, you could argue that it is, but then you need to teach it, right? And it needs to be attainable, okay? And timed doesn't mean you've got 45 minutes per se. Timed is actually more about the fact that timed does not mean that the test itself is timed. I want to make this very clear. What timed means is what we really should say here is time bound for the goal. By the end of this week, you will be able to, okay? By January, our goal is, okay? Not that it's nebulously out there somewhere forever. Timed only means this is the time we have to work on it. So I think probably a better way, instead of saying timed, would be time bound for the goal itself. That's for the goal. It is not the assessment. Is everybody clear about that? Okay. So I don't want you to mix that up. Okay, we're going to move on. And we're going to start to do some, I have plenty of examples for you that we're going to be able to look at in a minute so that this will all pin itself down. But in the meantime, we have not really talked about Bloom's taxonomy. Has anybody ever heard of Bloom's taxonomy before? Okay, it's an education term, and actually there are variations on this. You can look up modern variations of Bloom's. You can look up, there's one called Krakau's taxonomy. There's a Bloom's that's actually been put into a circle that I really like. But for a basic beginning information about Bloom's, this is comprehension. This is cognitive domain. Remember that we're more than our cognitive domain, aren't we? We are also our affect. We are also our social emotional learning. But let's just look at our cognitive domain. Now, according to Bloom, as you go up this scale, the cognitive demand becomes greater. There's a greater cognitive demand as you go up. So Bloom broke it into lower order and higher order. I won't get into philosophy. All right, I will briefly. Why might it bother me a little bit to talk about lower and higher thinking skills in this case? Anybody know? Well, I want you to think about that. I want you to keep thinking in your heads as we go through this. Why does it need to have an issue with lower and higher order thinking skills? Just think it. Just think it. In the meantime, let's talk about what the lower ones are. So remembering, okay, that's rote learning. That's just simply memorizing for your test. So a lot of the tests you might take might be rote learning. If they are, that's a lower level skill. It's a bottom line cognitive function. It basically is, can you memorize something? And you get rewarded for memorizing. The next one up is understanding, which really is just basically saying meaning of the materials. So if I say, what is the ZPD? And you recite back zone of proximal development, that's recall. If I can say, what does that mean? You say, it's the zone where people learn, and below is what I already know, and above is fight or flight. That's understanding. Do you see the difference? In one case, you can memorize, and in the other, you're thinking about it a little bit more. Then you have applying. That would be me saying to you, okay, can you give me an example of something in a classroom or in the work we've had together that indicates using the ZPD? It's not something you have in your notes. You can't go through your notes and go, oh, Johnny does this, right? It's something I'm asking you to now apply the ZPD to something that you can think of in your life or in a student or whatever. Most of you, I bet, could do that right now. That's applying. The next thing is actually analyzing. So now we want to analyze it, okay? We aren't yet to evaluating and creating, but for analyzing and evaluating get very close together. You don't have to, again, am I giving you a test on this that you have to do recall? I'm not. What I'm wanting you to think about is how cognitive demand changes, okay? So analyzing would be something like looking at a child who's had these issues and say, can I not only apply it, but can I kind of analyze in there what I need to do and make it work? So it's a next level cognitive demand. You're analyzing something, you're saying, if you've ever done science and you've had data that you've looked at, okay? You're not evaluating that data yet, you're analyzing it. You're saying, what am I looking at? What is this saying? What is this kind of doing? And then comes evaluating, which is kind of like a judgment on it. What does this mean? What do I think? When I ask you to hold something up in your hands, we are evaluating in a lot of ways. We're saying, yeah, I buy that. I don't know. Does the ZPD always work for this or does it not? Or maybe I have a different way of thinking. Anita's river analogy is all right, but I'm missing some pieces to this. We're starting to evaluate. Now, that doesn't mean our opinion is always right. A higher cognitive demand asks us to prove that analysis a little bit, right? To kind of put a little bit of oomph behind your thoughts. You can't just come out with saying, I think all elephants are purple, and if I feel like that, then that's what it is. That's my opinion. Evaluating is more than that. It's actually taking what you know and kind of doing some synthesizing and trying to kind of come up with moving your learning forward. And then the last one is creating, which is really, and by the way, there are different models that actually flip some of these. Those top ones are very integrated. Actually, all of these are pretty integrated, which is why I have found a circle model that I really like, because it kind of indicates that we move in and out of these things all the time, right? Different metaphor of your own and see if you can get it to apply to what you're doing. Or creating might be that you're doing something that's a whole new creation from yourself that is not just applying, but in fact doing something new and different with it. So these cognitive demands go up in some essence here, right? Now, to learn about the ZPD this week, you cannot possibly have done all of that up there if you didn't do some of this. Okay, so now, why might I have a slight challenge in my head? What am I doing? And I look at this and say, I have a little challenge with this idea of lower versus higher. Can anybody tell me? Why might that kind of bother me a little bit?
Because there may be natural differences in students themselves who can and cannot.
Okay, so there might be, so there's an implied judgment, isn't there, right off the bat? Exactly. So there may be students that are kind of still down around this, working with this. That does, their brains are just as engaged. They are actually doing a lot of hard thinking, okay? You all have you've done memorization for classes before. We all have, okay? There's a lot of thinking that goes into that. Why else might it bother me to think about lower and higher? Yeah.
So if you think about it, right, so lower would be what we have considered like people who have already done it. Like this is normal for everyone.
Yeah, right.
And the higher you go, but there's a good chance that remembering might not be easy for someone. But
right.
Analyzing would be easier.
That's right, exactly. Like, aren't we kind of in a way doing all of these things? I mean, you can say, well, I can analyze that, but don't make me recite it back. Or, I'm terrible with dates and names from history, right? Like, but I can tell you all about the concepts. But I'm not, if you were to ask me the exact date of that special education law, I'd have to be like, oh, wait a minute. I know it's somewhere around. How do I know that? I know that because I remember what's happening in history around that time, right? So you're exactly right. We draw on different things depending on the information we need. So the circle model, and I don't have it up here, but I've been exploring how to think about blooms, to think about knowledge. So how does this relate to assessment? Because when I set my standards and my goals, I want to try to include a bunch of these different things. So on the assessment you took yesterday, we might have said something like, what are 3 points about the American system? That's kind of recall, maybe understanding, right? Some of these. And then I might say to you, how does that compare to your own experiences or to the Indian system? Now I'm asking you to actually apply and do a little analyzing, all right? Now I didn't ask you to evaluate. I didn't say, what do you think about this? Or what do you think? You know, we could have gone further with that. We didn't need to for that. So you can see how when I asked you to create your own rivers that you're kind of in, and we did your river exercise, you were creating. You were creating. Everybody did a different thing. What everybody had on that was completely different. They were all different. Nobody's was identical to the other. You couldn't say, can I borrow your river and can I just copy your river? Because that would be ridiculous, right? Active creation comes from the self, all right? Okay, important to remember, and if you ever are sort of stuck for where your cognitive demands are, or when you're thinking about building lessons and information, we want to try to touch on a bunch of these. What I ask my students to do is when they build their lesson plans, when they're building their assessments, can they align it with one of these pieces of blooms? And I'm not taking off if they're wrong. If they say, I think they're analyzing, or say, I disagree, I think they're understanding. I don't do that. The point is, again, are we aware that there are multiple skills? And if all I've asked on an assessment is keeping it in these realms, or if all I'm asking is up there, then yes, I'm going to lose some students. I'm going to address some skills for some and not for others. and so on. So let's keep that in mind as we work through assessment. Okay, now I'm going to provide you with some rubrics. I don't have, this is not a very snazzy slide here. So I'm going to show you some examples, and then we're going to be able to do a couple of things together. Okay, so give me just a second here. I want to pull up. I think what I'll do, so what I want to talk about is rubrics. So I want to go to this link. Now, the nice thing about technology today is that it will do a lot of this rubric building for us. When I was first starting to work with rubrics, it was all me. I just sit down with charts and papers and my colleagues. I'm not promoting any given website. I just put in a search for free rubric maker. There are a number of them. I don't spend money on any of these things. So I liked this one, and it's free, at least at some basic level, it's free. So I'm happy with it. But I could sit down and do this by hand if I wanted to. I am not dependent on any given site. I make rubrics constantly. I really am a firm believer in a rubric system. So what is a rubric? A rubric is really just a system, a chart to help us assess according to criteria. All right. If you go back to what I started today with, which was we've got our criteria or our goals or our standards, we want to build an assessment that matches them. I want to show you some really good things about a good rubric, okay? So I'm going to go ahead and give you some examples. And I did fill one out for this class just for fun using this exact rubric maker. But let's call this, somebody give me a topic of something you either learn, not this class, let's do something else because I've got one for this class. Think about a topic you either teach or learn that is a unit or not the whole course, but just like a section of a course that you're learning about. Anybody, tell me anything you're either teaching or learning.
Types of variables in research.
Types of variables in research. Great, that's a great one. Variables in research. And I don't need to describe or do anything like that. And I'm not going to do maximum and minimum scores. We'll just do no score right now because I don't want to complicate. Did you notice that on that scoring, it gave a maximum of 100? We're so bound by a 100-point system. A rubric, you can't do it on a rubric. So that does irritate me a bit. But let's just say, so now I would like to build a criteria. Let's see, what is this? Oh, right. Types of variables in research. What do I want students to know when they're studying variables in research? What's one of the things I think I might need to teach them?
When they're doing some research, so for me, they should have some prior knowledge,
Some previous knowledge about the topic.
And we want them to understand the function of the variable.
The function of the variables. Okay, so we've got two different things going on here. We've got some previous knowledge. Now, I can't teach previous knowledge. So what am I going to do for a criteria? I might say that I would like the student to, let's change that a little bit, to build on known information. And then my next criteria is going to be, how did you word it again? The functions. Can we come up with one more thing we really want to make sure students know when we're working with variables? Maybe we want to actually be able to know how to.
Understanding of it.
That's what I was thinking too. What did you say?
In the practical
Y-
Use of
The practical use of the variable. Okay. Which is similar in a way to function, but let's keep going with this. Okay, so understand the practical okay. And then for a particular thing, I might say that you must know, you must be able to articulate a number of variables involved in whatever you're doing. Okay. Now notice my wording on these. I may need to keep changing from time to time. Now, this has a 3-point rubric. I'm going to add a column, and I'm going to call this one, I actually want the column to be, I'm going to move this column over to here, and I'm going to call this one you'll see an example of 1, 2 for this class. So when I build a rubric, this may feel to you like a brand new, like this is a lot of work. What I'm telling you is it actually is, you get it into your head how to start building rubrics, and it's really not hard to do. What it does is it helps you as the instructor or the person doing this, whatever it is you're doing with people, to help pin down really what you're looking for. And so it's much more clear. So if somebody says to me, why did I get a C, or what does this grade mean? I can point to a rubric chart very easily. Now, a 4-point rubric is actually best, and research bears this out. And the reason that a 4-point rubric is best is that if you, and this is interesting in psychology, very often we use 5-point rubrics for a Likert scale, if you're right, which is fine. In those settings, a 5-point scale actually works very well. But for a rubric, we don't want an odd number. We want an even number. And the reason is that when we grade, we have a tendency to float to the middle. Okay, and so in a Likert scale, you have enough differentiating between what each of those categories are psychologically that even if you float to the middle, you're learning some other things there. Whereas in an assessment, you don't want an odd number, because invariably teachers and graders and so on will float to that middle. So 4 points, I've seen 6-point rubrics that work all right. I'm not a huge fan of the 6. I like the 4, but I'll explain to you why. Most rubrics that most of us use in the US now are 4-point rubrics. Now, those 4 points largely align. We're not going to start at this column. We're going to start at this column. And this column is proficient, which means where I want to start is what does it mean to actually meet this criteria? So let's fill in our chart a little bit here. So building on known information, what does it actually look like to have to build on prior information? What, at a basic expectation, what do I expect students to do? I expect students will note at least, or will note 2 points of prior knowledge from this course or their own experiences. Is it measurable? Yes. Is it specific? Yes. Is it attainable? Yes. Okay. I am allowing the information to come from their own experiences or from the course material that I'm teaching. Okay. From there, I can now say, if you do better than that, so I can now fill this box out to say, students build in at least, or 3+ points, and so on, and I can finish that up. And then here, students note 1 point, etc. And here, students haven't been able to build on prior knowledge. No prior knowledge noted. Okay, functions of variables. We start to say, what do I expect as a bare expectation of showing me that you know this? I would say that I expect you to be able to talk about, let's say, functions of at least 3 of the variables, and so on. Okay, now again, because I'm not teaching that class, I can't pop it in. I'll show you an example from this class in a minute. But the point is I start here, which is my meeting. You're meeting the expectation. You are proficient. Okay, that means you've passed, you're doing fine. Okay, here you're partially meeting, you're getting there. Okay, you're doing what we might call emerging, like a butterfly coming out of its cocoon, okay, or its chrysalis. Here, you really are kind of having some issues and some challenges, but you tried. We have something we can base a rubric on. And here you've gone above and beyond in some way or done something sort of extra or exceptional. Okay, a 4-point rubric, sort of ish, can match with it. I always tell my students, if you don't know where you fall on this, so we normally put a number here. That'd be a 4, a 3, a 2, and a 1. And I start with the 4 in this column because as you're coming out of the criteria, this is the best you can be, and then it goes down to here. So 4, 3, 2, 1 largely aligns with an A, B, C, D, except now I have proof as to why. You say, why did I get a B minus? Well, because you did this, 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 and this, right? So now I can kind of do my numbers. There is one huge caution that I continue to see happening when teachers use rubrics. A rubric score is never a percentage. It is never a percentage. In a way, this rubric automatically builds in starting at a 50%, if you want to think of it that way, okay? Or it actually builds in more like a 60%. Let me show you why. Let's say you are proficient. You've done everything I've asked you to do, and you get a 3, a 3, a 3, and a 3. If I use percentages, that's 75%, which in an American system is a C. But in fact, you've really earned a good solid B range. So you're actually, a rubric translated to a percentage will always harm a student. The only time it doesn't harm a student is if they're all A's and then they get 100%, which benefits them. Okay, so all of a sudden I've got a student who did all of this and a student that did all of this. And if I translate to a percentage, I've really harmed almost all of my students in my class. I've seen teachers do this over and over and over again. When my own kids were growing up, they'd bring back their work. They'd say, well, I didn't do very well on this. I got a C. And they'd look at it and I'd say, no, you didn't. Your rubric score shows that you actually came out in a B range. So then I'd go and I'd talk with the teacher and I'd say, rubric scores don't get translated into percentages. Okay, again, it's just simple math, all right? Here, even if you got all of this down, you're not at a 0. And you're not even at a 25%. You're at more like a D range, which I'd put you in at maybe a 6. You tried, you did something. We've got to keep working on it. So our school systems in the US a handful of years ago largely shifted to using 4-point rubrics because 4 points makes a whole lot more sense than 100 points or even than 25 points, right? So if I say, do you know the difference between a 9 and a 10 on a 10-point answer, you cannot say that you do. But if I tell you, do you know the difference between a 1 and a 2, yes, you do. So I one time heard somebody use the analogy, this is not my analogy, it's that you have a candy bar, just a regular-sized candy bar, okay? And that candy bar is divided into 100 pieces. Think of how tiny. Okay, I've only got to 50 and I'm halfway. Think of a candy bar split into 100 pieces. It's just like crumbs, right? I scoosh a few crumbs this way and I scoosh a few crumbs this way. And you say to me, wait a minute, did you scoosh 20 crumbs or was that 23 crumbs? I have absolutely no idea. I've just scooshed some crumbs. But if I have a candy bar and I say, can we break it into 4 pieces? Yeah, I've got that pretty clear. So a 4-point rubric is very clear. And it sets your criteria, and it's a whole lot easier for me to say, you've got a quarter of that candy bar, you've got a half of that candy bar, you've got 3/4 of the candy bar, you've got the whole candy bar. In no circumstance do you fail to have any part of that if you've tried, if you put something down where we're working with you, okay? All right, So a rubric is something I actually really like. Now, I started today by saying there's no such thing as a perfect assessment. Rubrics have plenty of challenges, but I much prefer to use a rubric. I use rubrics when I grade students. I use rubrics all the time. I can show you examples of ones that I use. I just build them out. Sometimes I use a more generic one, but very often I apply it to the class. So let me show you the one, a sample that I did. Right here. Okay. Let's take a look at what I did for our class. I don't know how clear this is to you. I think you all can read this all right. Here's what I did using the exact rubric maker that I just showed you, okay? Let's start in this column. Remember, we're starting in what I would call kind of the B range column, or the you are meeting. How do I know that you've left this week meeting what I want you to leave this week with? Okay, I have certain things. Shivani, ma'am, and I have certain things we want. Can you articulate? Notice how clear that is. Not just, can you say, it's not just a nebulous thing. It's the student can articulate key elements of the purposes and history of educational movements in India and the US. Can you just give me some basic historical information? Okay, if you can do that pretty well, and here's what can you give 3 elements from each country and make 1 to 2 comparisons? Guess what you had a question on yesterday? It wasn't exactly this, but you see what I'm saying, right? Can you give at least 4? Then you're going to get even a higher grade. Can you give 2 elements? You may struggle to make those comparisons, but you got some elements in there, right? And then can you only give 1, or maybe you just couldn't make the connections at all? Then maybe you just get a 1. So that's a 1, a 2, a 3, and a 4, okay? Now again, this doesn't work perfectly in thinking about our papers yesterday because those were 3-point answers and so on. So it's an imperfect comparison. What I'm trying to do is help you get your head around thinking about what we mean when we assess. So another one, can you name some key people in education? So, and I even put some examples here, Tagore, Dewey, Mann, Piaget, Vygotsky, right? Some of these names starting to ring a bell that you maybe didn't know before, or maybe you did know and you hadn't really thought about it. Can you name 3 and give a couple of sentences about their contribution? Can you name at least 4 and explain their contributions? Can you name 2 and give a little bit about, or can you name 1 and maybe don't note their contributions? Now, what if you have somebody that can name 5, but don't ever mention their contributions? That's where rubrics can get very tricky, because now they've exceeded on one of these. So you should never put too much into this. You don't want to have too many things because you can really get yourself down a rabbit hole that you can't get out of. All right, can you identify some key theories of education? Okay, and again, and so forth. Can you define, explain, and note the benefits of inclusive education for various subgroups? Now, I stopped there, but I could have kept going. I mean, we had more. I could put an assessment piece on here. What I'm showing you is I use that rubric to fill this out. We did not use this rubric for you, but I play around with rubrics all the time because I want to ask myself, have I set a clear goal? Do I have a measurable thing you can reach? So if I just said some, so another flaw to rubrics is sometimes somebody says, can name some elements, can name a lot of elements, can name a few elements. What is your sum may look like my many, right? So I put an actual number. Okay, is it measurable? Is it smart? Does it meet all of those SMART criteria? Okay. And I could say, if I want it to be that time-bound one, I could say by the end of this week, students will be able to do this. Okay. So take a breath. I want you to think about what I've said about rubrics and rubric building. You may not be in a situation where you ever build a rubric. You may not be in a situation where you ever receive a rubric. But I will tell you that we use rubrics. I will show you an example. We're hiring somebody to come in for a visiting professor for next year in our department. So we sat down and we built a rubric. And we did not actually put it as the same exact form that you just saw, but we sat down together as a department. We created this. It didn't exist before. We just were looking at this saying, well, we want them to have some qualifications. We want them to have a terminal degree in education or a related field. Usually that means a PhD or an EDD. We want them to have specialty areas that support our education minors. We want them to have experience working with children and youth in a public school. Remember that for us means government school setting. So we really want whoever's coming in to have experience working in our government schools and does not significantly overlap with Bronwyn or Anita's work because we're the ones that are also going to be there. We don't want too much overlap with our work. Okay. And then we go on. We have a bunch of criteria. We have some evidence. Okay. Is it measurable? If I just think, I don't know, maybe they like kids, maybe they don't. That's not evidence, right? So I have to have evidence. Do we have, and notice that this is kind of like a 4, 3, 2, 1, isn't it? It's like, cannot evaluate, minimal, adequate, abundant, right? So loads of evidence of the work they've done with children in public schools, okay? Loads. Here's one that's maybe, the next candidate has some. Next candidate, I actually don't see, I don't see anything there, so I just have to put this. Do you notice it's a 4-point rubric with evidence, and then any additional notes just in case I may be off or not thinking in the same way as one of my colleagues. When there were 3 of us that came together to look through, we were so closely aligned. Do you know why? Because this was measurable, because we could prove it, because we could put our finger onto it and say, notice this right here. And we could do the same for all of these. Teaching, look at this, commitment to inclusive pedagogy. What have we learned about this week? Commitment to undergraduate teaching and mentorship in a liberal arts context. That's important for us in what we do. So if somebody comes out of a very large university that maybe they're working with PhD students, that's kind of minimal evidence that they could maybe transfer that to our setting, all right? Potential to teach our beginning class and some electives, ability to advise students. We want to make sure that doesn't always come through, but maybe in a letter of recommendation or in a cover letter, they say, I've done a lot of advising of students, so the evidence is here, and I can mark it here, okay? And so on. Experience working with historically underrepresented first generation and marginalized student populations. We have that as a commitment, a #1 commitment. So if our candidate cannot do this, they're going to end up with some lower scores, okay? We had 87 applicants, which for you might seem like not a lot. I don't know in the Indian system if you have 300, but I will tell you that for us, that was a lot of applicants. We filled this out for 87 applicants, okay? But because we had the rubric, we could go through it pretty well and talk about it together. And then did they have their components? And to be honest, this was either yes or no. This is just they've got what they were told to submit, okay? They either have a cover letter or they don't. They either have a resume or they don't, CV, okay? So those weren't really scored in the same way. And then yes, we wanted to invite them to a Zoom interview. Maybe we do, and no, we really just don't see enough evidence, okay? So a good use of a rubric. What I'm trying to say is you may not use rubrics in a classroom in the same way. You may be trying to make a decision about something. You can set up what your criteria are. You set up a scale. You can set it up however you want to, okay? So using a rubric pins you down, and it keeps your criteria very clear, okay? So there's an example. Does that make sense? Are you all with me on this? Okay. Hang in there because we can see if I have any other. So that's quick rubric. Here's a holistic one. I did it as a bullet point. I'm not a big fan of kind of really showing you this one, but basically in an A presentation, which I could say for a 4, you can't read this, but it basically says, make eye contact, posture, and so on, if possible. So if somebody can't make eye contact, like my daughter who is visually impaired, she can't make eye contact, you don't mark her down for it because it's if possible. You can't mark somebody down for something they are unable to do, right? And so on. Delivers in a loud, clear voice. I mean, so anyway, it's basically the same thing. We just have it in a bullet format here instead of the other. Okay. So let's, I will get out of that. Let's kind of just shake it out a little bit here. I'm going to get out of this one. And we're going to take a little bit of a break for a minute. And then we're going to come back around and I'm going to show you some lesson plan templates. And then we'll play a game and we'll kind of shake it out. Okay, so take a couple of minutes. Is this all right to do that right now? 20? Okay, it's a good marking spot. But just to kind of settle before we break, what I want you to think about is assessing needs to match your criteria. And the best way to do that is to be crystal clear about what each thing matches. So whether you're working in psychology, whether you're working with students, whether you're in a job that asks you to make some decisions, rubrics can be used for anything. And they are really a sharp tool, okay? They are not perfect. They are not perfect. There are a lot of flaws in a rubric, but I prefer them over a lot of other kinds of assessing, okay? I actually think the way we did the assessment yesterday works out very well. It was very clear, 3 points isn't 10, right? 3 points adds up and you get your score, all right? So I don't know how that translates, but I think that works pretty well. It's a similar thing in a way. I could have sat down and done a rubric for that and it would have worked out pretty well, okay? All right, let's take a minute, let's shake it out, give you 10 or 15 minutes, and we'll come back around, say at 11:05. And we'll wrap up with looking at some lesson design. Okay? Am I there? All right. Okay. Okay, do we have people back for the most part? Okay. Okay, so we are going to wrap up with a couple of other points about lesson planning, and then we're going to do our Kahoot, and then we're going to kind of wrap it up. And if you have questions or other thoughts, we can open it up to discussion, and then we'll close it out for the week. So what I wanted to show you was that there is a principle called, no, oh, actually, let me write it in here while I still have this. Understanding by design, or what we might call UBD, is also sometimes called backward design. Okay. I had neglected to write this down, but the next slide is actually about this. So there is an entire theory and practice intertwined that is built around what we call understanding by design. So what that means is that we are not simply, we are actually, we have an articulated purpose and design to the way that we set up understanding in classrooms. This is an extremely well-known tool and program. And you can put in to a Google search anytime you want, and I do it quite often because I don't always have these right on hand, UBD templates or understanding by design templates. But one of the key pieces of understanding by design is what we call backward design. And backward means that, remember how we set our criteria, we set our standards, we set our goals. That's kind of the guidepost that's kind of at the end that we want people to reach. Backward design says start there. Let me say traditionally what somebody might do. Oh, wouldn't it be fun to think about how, to learn about forests? Yeah, that would be fun. What do you want to think? I don't know, like maybe the different kinds of mushrooms that grow. That's a great idea. You know what I love? I love moss. Yeah, moss is great too. Oh, I know. I really want to know about how rivers kind of and streams go through and build like little ponds. Yeah, that's a great idea. So all of that is just like jumping from activity to activity, but I don't have an articulated standard yet. So if I start with a standard, students will be able to name 3 types of something, flora and fauna that live in, that are part of forest biomes, okay? Now I can back up and say, do types of mushrooms fit that? Yes, it actually could. Do my little vernal ponds fit that? Yes, they kind of do. How about, can I learn about some animals in the forest? Does that fit it? Yes, it can. So if I start with my standard, I'm not just building in something arbitrary. So one of the examples I like to use, because I have taught French over the years, so in language learning, back in the day when I was growing up, pre-standard kinds of thinking about this, the teacher might say, I know, let's have a day where we just make crepes in class. That would be, wouldn't that be fun to just, you know what crepes are, like little thin pancake, right? Wouldn't that be fun to just have a day that we do that? Yes. But now we have to say, wait a minute, I'm not saying give up the crepes. I would never say give up the crepes. But I am saying, let's start with a standard. And maybe a standard is students will be able to engage in culturally relevant traditions. Because maybe that's an important part of knowing French culture. So one of those things might be a crepe day. But if I can't tie it here, then I really should probably let it go. I don't want to let go of crepes. Maybe there's a different way I can do it. Maybe we can have a little party that's going to go. Everybody awake? Okay. Maybe we can do a little party at the end where we do it, or maybe there's another time or a space for it. Or maybe I can say, how about after school? Who wants to make crepes today after school? But that's separate from what we're maybe getting a grade on or what our criteria is. So backward design says, if you don't start here, you may end up with a bunch of stuff that doesn't fit and doesn't belong. So I'm going to show you the next template, and I use this with my own students at Bates as well. So I've taken the Understanding by Design template and I've set it out a little differently from what, and I like the UBD. Remember UBD, Understanding by, what is UBD? Say it one more time. So the templates are great. There's some really great templates, but I actually find the UBD templates a little overwhelming at times. So for my students, I actually set this up slightly differently. And notice that I go step 1, step 2, and step 3. Why? I'm going to show you why. Step 1, what are we starting with? We're really starting, in a sense, at the end. We're starting with, what do we need to leave here knowing? We need to know 3 points of 3 theories of education. We need to know, what does a good assessment look like? We need to know, so I am setting, and you can call these whatever you want to. I mean, people call them different things. We call them learning performance thing. I mean, there's every imaginable name for this, but it's basically our criteria. On that rubric we built, those are the side criteria, okay? Now, the best stems to use, the student will be able to, makes us have a good, so let me give you an example. Is it a goal or is it not a goal if I say, students will play a Kahoot game today? Think about that for a second. I really want you to think about that. Is it a goal of this week to say students will play a Kahoot game today? That is an activity. It is not a standard. Now, this gets mixed up constantly, okay? Teachers that have been in the field for years will do this, okay? So I work with my students a lot about the difference between a criteria or a goal and an activity, okay? We're going to get to activities in a minute, but that's why I say students will be able to. Do I have as a goal students will be able to play Kahoot? No, because you could leave this class, never learn to play Kahoot, and be fine on all of my assessments. That's an activity. It is not one of my goals, okay? How about this one? Students will complete 3 worksheets today. Is that a goal? No, it really isn't. Now, you could say, well, I have a number they need to get through, but really that's not an academic goal. That's an activity, okay? That's an activity. So please think strongly about this. This is one of the most common things that my own students do, and these are people that have had this for 4 years. They've been having this training built into them, okay? And we still mix up activities and goals. But if we start with this stem, students will be able to, or students will know. This really helps us. Students will be able to complete math problems using multiplication up to the 10s. Now, it doesn't matter. I could give 3 assignments. I could give 2 worksheets. I could give games. We could do a Kahoot. It doesn't matter. We're going to get to that in a minute. But my goal is what they need to be able to do. So for you all, we have goals. We have objectives. Call them what you will. Now, I've set those. Those are my criteria on that rubric chart. The very first slide we ever gave on this class was our goals and our objectives of the week. Now let's skip all the way over to here, which is step 2. How will I know that you've met that goal? And hello, assessment, okay? Everything I said first part of today. My assessments must match my goals. So in this case, I tell students sometimes to even draw the line over. So evidence that we will collect to prove the attainment of these step 1 goals. What is the evidence going to be? In your case, it was a 8 questions out of 10. It was an assessment that was a written short answer assessment with 10 questions, okay? It might be a poster. It might be a group engagement of some kind, okay? What is the evidence that I'm going to collect? That evidence should link directly with what my goals are here. By the way, I don't want more than 2 to 4 goals, maybe 5. I think we had like 5 listed, something like that. I don't want too many because then it becomes cumbersome and it's really hard to make sure I cover all of those, okay? These also I don't want, I might have one assessment that covers all of this, or I might have 2 different things that we do. We have not talked about formative versus summative assessments, but when we play a game, when we do those charts that you glued the pieces on, those are formative. You're not getting graded for those. You are working with something that I can now see. Where are the confusions? What am I learning? So a formative assessment, again, I don't want to throw too much at you, but it's assessment for learning, meaning I can use that as a formative thing to get us where we need to be. Summative assessments are those big ones that have evaluations attached to them. Those are the ones where you're getting your scores. I'm not putting a score on your charts. I'm not putting a score on your Kahoot. You might get candy for it, but you're not getting scored, right? You can do poorly on Kahoot and it's fine, but we can learn from it, okay? So what is the evidence that you're doing this? And I need to see the evidence. You can't just tell me, I know it all, I just put it on the paper. I need to see it, okay? But now the question is, how do we get from here to here? And step 3 are actually the learning experiences that get us here. So I have my goals. I know what it's going to look like. I don't say, come back on Friday, take the test. What I do is I build all sorts of, this is everything we do day by day. This is the Kahoot. This is the little pieces of paper. This is the turn and share. This is the, hand of 5. This is the lecture notes. This is the PowerPoint, okay? This is actually the steps I'm taking to get us there. Now, I bet that a number of you have been in classes, my own kids included and myself included, where a teacher will say something like, students will be able to spell words that have an EA or EE pattern in them. And then I say to the class, to my first graders or second graders or third graders, quizzes on Friday. Come in ready to take that quiz. I don't do much throughout the week, and on Friday I say, take out a piece of paper. Number 1, beach. Number 2, cheek. Number 3, green. But I have not done any of the structured scaffolding to get my students here. So I say to students, this is your set of 10 words. You're going to be tested on Friday. Some of those kids get home and they have a parent like me who neurotically sits down and builds up flashcards, and all week long we're going, oh, I have my finger on my cheek, CHEEK, right? And some kids lose the sheet before they even get out of the school building and have no idea by the time Friday rolls around, and they have not been scaffolded for that learning. If I say to those kids, come in on Friday and take this test, and some kids do poorly on it, I don't think that's the child's fault. That's not teaching. That's just how much support do you have at home. That's just how organized are you. I've taught you nothing. I've taught you nothing at all. Nothing. But if I play a couple of games, if we do some bingo activities, if I give you some tricks for remembering how to remember cheek versus beach, okay, if we play around, if I have a word wall that has them up on it for the week so you can see them, if I give you bonus points every time you use one of these words, now I've got activities all the way through the week so that when I say, pull out a sheet of paper now, it's time to take our test, I want all of my students to succeed. Am I going to get 100%? No, I will not. Will I get maybe 80%? Maybe. But I sure will get more than 20% that had good support at home to build some flashcards, right? Okay, this is true no matter what we teach at any level ever, that here is the teaching. Right here is the ZPD. Right here is how we are responsive to our learners, okay? So if I say, learn this, come back and take your test on Friday, then you don't even need to be here, or we just forget it, because I'm not doing anything to help you with that, right? So this engagement is where I get my outcomes on the assessment that proves that my students have done this work. Now, some people talk about things like, I don't know if you've ever heard the term grade inflation, or, well, a teacher gives out too many A's. All of those conversations become just moot. They're ridiculous conversations to have if you're following this pattern. It doesn't matter how many A's I give or how many. Part of me says, if I've taught this right, all of my students should be succeeding, right? Are they all going to? No, they are not all going to. But if I've done this part well and right, I should get a pretty high number of successful students. I am not trying to set them up to fail. I'm trying to set them up to succeed. So some people like to think about a bell curve, but we've kind of thought about that to be the J curve, which is that I want my students to have more of a high end. I want to have a lot more A's and B's or whatever your system is, right? I want everybody on that assessment you took yesterday, and some of you maybe just ran out of time, but I want everybody to feel success from that. Because if we've set the week up right, you've done enough to engage your brain, your body, your soul, to be able to show me evidence of learning. So I use this with my students all the time that are learning how to be teachers, and I ask them to fill this out. Then I ask them, what will it look like? And then how do we get our students there? We build that bridge. And we build it for the student. We don't just expect some of them to have, it's like the tree, right? We don't just, some of them are monkeys and some of them are fish, right? But that's not a judgment. It's just saying, I have all of those students that I want to be able to reach the top of the tree. I'm not changing the treetop. I'm changing what else I'm doing here. So all of this makes sense for what we've studied this week, right? Think about that differentiation, maybe having some different ways of showing what you know. There's lots of different ways in which all of our week come together when we think about lesson planning. I'm going to show you one more thing, and then we'll move to the Kahoot, and we'll have time for some questions. So this is one of the courses. We have a course management system. This is the lesson plan that I ask my students to fill out. You may have trouble seeing this. This is all based in UBD. What does that stand for again? Understanding by design. So this template is based very heavily on the understanding by design template. So the first thing I ask them, and you can see it right up there, right? Understanding by design. It's slightly adapted for my context and my students. But we ask big ideas. What are the essential kinds of questions that I want people to, remember I said I like the question? So maybe a question is, how do we create the best classroom material to enhance learning? I don't have to have every answer. I don't have to have answers for all of these. I just need to be, maybe if I teach an art class, my essential question might be something like, what is the purpose of art in society? If I'm teaching literature, maybe it's how does literature reflect the human experience? If we're learning about research, maybe my question is, how does research intertwine with practice? Or why should we think about doing research? They're just big questions. They're big life questions. And they float around in the air, and we hope we don't have to answer them. We just need to think about them. And then these turn into key understandings, which is something like, what is the purpose of art in society? Maybe a key understanding is art helps us tap into a creative energy that we otherwise wouldn't have access to, or something like that. So these are kind of, and again, these float around in the air. We don't need to necessarily get at all of those. Now notice here I ask my students to build their standards, just what I just talked about. We call them standards, and there are some national standards that I can look at. Then here I actually break out standards and objectives, because objectives are our learning objectives day by day. This is a daily lesson plan. So today's objectives would be around assessment and lesson planning, whereas yesterday's objectives would have been something different, would have been differentiated instruction, right? Okay. And then here are our activities, but notice I don't just say, I always make my students do a teacher will and students will. Why? Because again, one of the danger zones is that when I build these activities that I think I'm building, I do things like teacher will present the information. Teacher will talk about factors, variables. Teacher will present assessment. There's absolutely nothing that tells me what students are doing. So I make my students not only say what the teacher is doing, but what the students are doing. Maybe students are just listening, but maybe students are writing notes. Students are filling out a guided note sheet. Teacher is circulating to make sure notes are okay. Okay? And then we have the assessment, and I build in a piece of differentiation. They must differentiate in their lessons, okay? This is the typical lesson plan that all of my students at any level do all the time. They must know how to do these lessons with the work that they do. Now, I introduce it in a lot of different classes, but it's not until they get to student teaching, and then they need to do these pretty much every day. Every day they do a lesson plan like this, okay? Now, again, if it's 3 out of 5 days or something like that, I mean, you can, it can be a little burdensome when you start to think about doing it every day, but I need this to get into their heads. And then I say attach any links, handouts, worksheets, answer keys, anything like that. When we come back in class to discuss, I tell them to bring in samples of student work with the names hidden, and I want somebody who did really well on that, whatever it is, paper, worksheet, test, and I want somebody who did really badly on it, and I want somebody who did in the middle on it. Names off it, and I want to see somebody who performed super well, somebody who really didn't perform well, and somebody in the middle. And I also want to know overall, how did your class do on that? And if overall class average is showing that things aren't going so well, then the question is, did we need to do something different? Right? Okay. So this is a sample of a lesson plan. Don't have to use this exact thing, but it helps us get our heads around. I keep lesson plans. I don't fill this template out every single time. What I do is I say, where am I going? What do I need my students to know? I also have a syllabus that also says this. What are my activities of the day? I always write those down, including any interactive things. How will I know? What will the assessment look like? I have that in my head. I've done this so many years, I kind of have a pretty good idea of that. And then what do I do if students maybe are absent? What do I do if a student needs extra support? What do I do if a student comes in and hasn't done what I asked them to come in and do? What do I do if I have a student that has a disability? What do? I have a student this last term who had a very severe concussion, and so she wasn't able to use her screens and things like that. So I had to differentiate for her and help her think through what she needed to do. So differentiation helps me think, where do I need to help figure out my fish and my birds and my monkeys and my elephants? Okay? I had a number of students that spoke other languages. So is there vocabulary that people are going to struggle with? Do I need to kind of explain the vocabulary? Okay? All right, settle. What do you have for questions? For thoughts. And I know for some of you, this is more relevant than for others. Not all of you are going out there into the bright blue world to build lesson plans. I actually think rubrics can be used like in the bright blue world, but lesson plans maybe not so much. However, having said that, even as a learner, we could even think to ourselves, did I get what I needed for those activities? Okay, we can ask even as a learner what's happening in a lesson. It's really helpful if we are teachers, but we don't need to be teachers to have this make sense. Yeah.
So I just wanted to know, when you're making those rubrics,
Yes.
let's say you have that done for the assignment that we did yesterday.
Yes.
The test we had yesterday.
Yep.
Will you be doing it for each question or an overall?
So that's a great question. The question is whether or not on something like what we did yesterday, would I build a rubric for each question? What I would likely do in a case like that is I would put each question, I would most likely put each question as a separate thing. However, having said that, let me just say that when I do that kind of an assessment, very often you can do a holistic assessment. So there's a difference between an analytic one that really is like name 3 things, which I could do for each of those questions. But there's also a holistic. And a holistic rubric I use with my students, for example, has an understanding of core concepts, is able to give clear examples. And it's more holistic, and it's a little bit more subjective and a little bit more vague. And so I have a colleague, she and I are very funny. We teach together a lot. We co-teach a lot of our student teachers. And I tend to be much more analytic. I want to say, they did 2, they did 3, they got this. And she's a lot more like, let's just holistically kind of look at this, because I live in fear of somebody saying, where exactly did this come from? And the holistic ones are a little bit more vague. So on a paper like that, we could have said, we have a chart that we set up with students have a core understanding of key concepts. Students are able to, maybe on that Bloom's chart, are able to create or analyze something. Students are able to, and then we could holistically do that. The way that that test was set up, I think, was very fair in essence, saying that every question had 3. 3 points so that it was pretty clear in our heads where a 1, a 2, or a 3 would come, but it might not be clear in your head. So let's say you say, well, I got a 1 on this and I don't get why. If I had a rubric, I could say this is exactly why, right? So it's a great question because, to be honest, I don't necessarily have a rubric for every single assignment that I do. I think that would be, I really like rubrics, but I also think that they need to be used when it's appropriate to use them. I used to use checklists a lot, like has this, has this, has this, has this, has this. I still sometimes use that. The problem you get into with checklists is that all of a sudden you're doing things like this one's worth 10 points, this is worth 5 points, this is worth 15 points, and I come right back to that question. Do you know the difference between a 12 and a 13? Because I sure don't. Do you know the difference between a 7 and an 8? You know, if you're giving 10 points for doing something, and then it ends up either being an all or nothing, and we end up punishing, when we do those checklists, we sway to the lower end. So there again, even if I do a checklist, I'll start at a 50%. I don't ever start anything at a 0. Like, everything started at a 50%. Because even with the checklist beyond that, I assume at a bare minimum, just because mathematically it's too rough. It really does hurt kids that struggle. It hurts them a lot more than it helps them to do that. Yeah. Yes. Yeah, that's a great question, and I know that that you missed some of what I said earlier. Let me say that's a great question. A checklist is another way to get at the assessing of what's been taught. So again, I don't want something on the checklist that was not part of my, so an example would be on the checklist, got something turned in on time. Well, on time, if I take points off for timeliness, that has nothing to do with whether you know chemistry, right? Having said that, I don't necessarily think it's bad to set a time frame because I've been in situations where there aren't, and then people, take forever or whatever, and it ends up being other problematic things. But the checklist should represent the criteria. Now, the other thing is, this shouldn't be a mystery to students. When I build rubrics, they have that right at the beginning of an assignment. There's no secrets. I don't need to hold my rubric and go, you have to guess what's on my rubric. I give those right out. If there's a checklist, I give it right out. So there are a lot of ways we can do assessment that lets people know what our criteria is. But the question about, sometimes they can be more holistic, sometimes they can be more analytic. It really partly depends on your preference. It depends on the activity. It depends on the subject matter. It depends on what you choose to do with them. I think the bigger thing is, are we holding it up and looking at it and saying, is this fair? Is it equitable? Because a lot of our assessments actually punish the ones, I always say we punish the already punished. We reward the already rewarded. Our systems in education tend to reward the already rewarded. And our systems tend to punish the already punished. So if I say, go home, learn your words, I'm going to give you 1 point for each word, there's 10. And then I'm going to translate it to a percentage, which means every single one of those words is 10 points off your score. I know who I'm punishing before I even send that assignment home. And I know who I'm rewarding before I even send it home. So that's why I say hold this up and think about this, because the point shouldn't be that we reward the already rewarded, right? We don't want to punish them either, but I'm just saying we need it to be equitable. Yeah.
Now in India, we have, especially for the board classes, we have the pattern of in the results, the grades and the scores, but there is no percentage pattern we follow in India.
There's not a percentage per se. Yeah, we use a lot of percentages, and that is good to know because I know the Indian system is different, but you're basing it on points. What happens to those points? Do they get converted in some way?
As an individual, I will find my percentage on my scores.
But if somebody gets, let's say, a 20 out of 25, how do you know if that's a pass or not pass?
So that is then the result. Declaration is there, pass or fail, that we declare. So in the report card, basically we have the scores out of 100, and then the grades corresponding, and then there's one line down which is pass or fail. That is it.
It's just pass or fail.
Either a pass or a fail. It is not like a topper.
Yeah, I see what you're saying.
It is not there.
Right,
My
right.
question is that whether you people follow that or not.
We give ABCD. We give GPAs, a GPA at the college level.
GPA even we follow now.
Okay, but a GPA is based on percentages largely. It's actually based on a 4-point rubric. Yeah, so GPA is a 4-point rubric when you get right down to it. In fact, I always tell my students, if you're confused about a 4-point rubric, look up how GPAs get calculated. Yeah, but a GPA is a rubric. It's a 4-point rubric. 4.0 is your A, 3.0 is a B, 2.0 is a C. I mean, a GPA is a rubric. So whenever I have students that are just really lost, I say, look up what a GPA is. Start there, because that is a 4-point rubric right there. But I see what you're saying, and that's why I ask you to think about this, because based on context, there may be a variety of different ways in which we think about this. The bottom line is the assessment fair? Is it measuring what we need it to measure? And do we have a way to make sure that we're not doing a bottom pull mathematically? Because that bottom pull mathematically happens when we have fewer points, not a rubric. A rubric is clear, but remember, a rubric is not a percentage, right? A rubric is not a percentage if there's anything. I mean, I wish I had a dime for every time I had to tell somebody a rubric is not a percentage. Oh, I wish I had. I would be a multi-billionaire. I could take over the Doge work that's happening. I could be right up there with Musk. If I had a dime for every time somebody had to say.
Just for curiosity, I want to ask, how many times you evaluate the child in the whole year?
How many times? We have quarter systems typically. Usually, there are some schools that run on trimesters. And actually, we also give midterm reports. So it's very, very common. In fact, even at Bates, we have midterm reports. So if somebody's in danger, or if somebody hasn't handed in some things, we don't wait till the end of a marking period. Again, that punishes the already punished, right? So if there's somebody missing something, we always do midterm, and that's a midterm assessment. Sometimes it's just a midterm report out. And then at that point, that's when we can catch people that may be starting to slip, because maybe I didn't know or didn't realize it till I went into my grade book. So even at Bates, we do a midterm. We get a reminder to flag anybody that's struggling. And it's a reminder to me to go in and say, okay, let me actually check to see how people are doing, because I don't necessarily know. Especially if you have a lot of students, you're not necessarily checking that all the time. So there's a midterm for each of whatever terms are. And in our K through 12 systems, it's usually by quarter. Almost always, quarter 1, 2, 3, and 4. Every once in a while, some schools use a trimester. Some of our local middle schools use a trimester system. We just break it into a third. Yeah. Yes.
In colleges, there are students who have language issues, they're coming from their concentration levels, etc.
Yep.
So do you in your system substitute assessment methods or exercises if somebody is not able to write in that language?
Mm-hmm.
So, but we know that they know. So how do
Yep. Yep. Yeah, exactly. So that's that differentiation. So the question was, if you have somebody that is speaking another language, which again in the US we do consider a sometimes marginalized group or a subgroup that might need extra supports, how do we differentiate if we need that assessment done? So all of the things we've learned would be saying something like, for example, first of all, my first question would be, systemically, are there supports on a campus for that student? So all of our school systems, and as far as I know, all of them have, or most of them have an ELL or an ML department or a teacher or a supervisor within that system. And at Bates, we have an Office of Intercultural Education. We have an Office of Accessibility. So we have offices that are systemic. Because one of the things we have to ask is, if we say to a student, you are welcome here, remember, it's not just access. It's not just whether you're taking a seat. It's whether you feel that you really do belong there. So number one is, are there systemic things in place? The second thing is, within the classroom, are there ways that I can differentiate not necessarily my content, but can I differentiate the product or the process? Meaning, if I have a student who's an English language learner, I have several students from China this term who have limited English, but they can keep up with the work. I check in with them periodically. Are they understanding? We do guided notes. I make sure this is at the college level. They've gotten accepted at a very good quality, high quality college. So I trust that they have a pretty good toolkit of strategies, okay? But when I give an assignment, there are some things that I do. I do overlook some grammatical things that I know are a language interference. So, for example, a very common language interference is to mix up your subject-verb agreement. So I might say he like milk instead of he likes milk, right? It's very, very common to mix up your verb agreement. I would never, ever take points off for somebody mixing up verb agreements. Okay, if I know that somebody has a native Hindi, you know, in English we use capital letters and periods at the ends of sentences. But if you're not in a system that's accustomed to doing that, and I'm punishing you for that, you're already at a disadvantage for not necessarily having that same skill set. So I'm not going to give you another disadvantage because you didn't put capital letters. So in other words, what are my pieces I need you to know? And are you meeting those pieces? Do you know the material? The other thing that I do is, quite honestly, I told you I do quizzes, but you always get 2 chances and you always get to look at your materials. Not everybody does this. I'm in a field where I can do this, so I'm not trying to say that everybody needs to do that. But in the case of somebody who has had a challenge due to language, that's where I can either let them redo something. And again, it's not an endless, I want to make it very clear, I don't believe in enabling somebody who isn't progressing in their zone of proximal development, okay? I don't know how to explain this, because even as a parent, there's a very fine line. I would rather be accused of enabling than of throwing somebody off a cliff, but I'm not a fan of being accused of enabling either. What I think is we give that support, right? So what I would say is, if somebody feels thrown off a cliff, can I bring it back down a little? One of the ways I can do that is to offer a second opportunity. One of the ways I can do it is say, use your notes, because I really want to get at those higher level thinking. You can use your notes for all the lower level stuff. That doesn't bother me. We have at the click of a button, we can get any information we need. You don't have to memorize everything now, okay? So those are some things that I would do. Another strategy I would use in the classroom is this group interaction, and go around and make sure that my language learners, my English language learners, are A, participating, and B, understanding. I might even give a little check-in periodically. Sometimes when my students are coming, I'll say, how are things going? How is this class going for you? Are you understanding everything? So there is a lot of language difference in our both Bates, but also in our community. As I said, we have a very large number, which is really unusual for Maine. And so teachers locally really work hard. You know what else we use? Google Translate, hello technology, okay? I have some of my Bates students placed in local classrooms where, let's say, there's 3 or 4 kids talking Somali with each other or speaking Arabic, and the teacher who does not know how to participate in that language will use Google Translate to be able to communicate. Some of these students are freshly arrived students who have almost no. There's one example of one of my students who came in and said, in my placement in like a 3rd or 4th grade, no, actually I think it's 6th grade, there's a boy who speaks Portuguese, but even the kids who speak Portuguese in the classroom have trouble understanding him because he has some speech impediments. So he didn't even speak Portuguese well. So the teacher is using Google Translate to try to communicate. She's also asking the other Portuguese kids, speakers, to try to do their best to help understand. So we can leverage language. If I say to this group speaking Arabic, you don't speak Arabic in my class, this is an English-only classroom, because what's my fear? You might be talking about me, right? I hear this, like, oh, you don't know what they're saying. Well, you could be passing notes and I don't know what you're saying either. And if you guys are talking together and working on something, I'll take the risk. Unless I see you all going, picking on somebody, then I might say, what are we talking about? And then I might encourage people to kind of make sure it's talking about the subject matter. But I hear a lot. They can't speak, I don't want them speaking Somali in my classroom because I don't know whether they're, I don't know what they're saying. But why do you need to know what they're saying? Maybe they're learning, right? Like, I just think we're better off erring on the side of good faith. I think that's my point. We're better erring on the side of good faith. I think very often that means relinquishing some control. Because if you all are talking Arabic, I lose control of that. But I have to be willing to say, but we're all friends here. Can you talk Arabic? I mean, when I taught in Delhi in 2016, I had a large university class, and I had a handful of students that really did not know English very well. So I would present a slide, I'd wait for a minute, and I'd say, can you all make sure everybody's understanding? Can you make sure everybody's understanding? Sometimes they'd turn and say it in Hindi. I'd say, fine, take a minute. Because instead of, I'm sorry, I'm moving on, you're gonna have to do that later. I mean, I don't know Hindi, so please explain it. Thank you, like that helps me, So I think we can build on language capacity, and remember, we can also see it as not just a need, but a, right, okay? All right, great question. Was there another question?
This is regarding Bloom's sticks and all.
Yes.
So I think they're also called K1, K2, K3.
Yeah, I know what you're saying. Yes, I know exactly what you're talking about. I think you're right. There's schema for knowledge, yes.
We are building these curriculums for students.
Yes.
We go from K1 to K6 in an order.
Oh, there we go. Okay,
Now
right.
K1 being remembering.
Yes, okay, so it's very similar. That's
So
right.
I just wanted to know, like, you always have that last creating
Yep.
in all your subjects, or is
Yeah.
there an instance?
This is why I'm going to tell you, I'm going to see if I can find this. I don't believe in a lockstep. Anything that says stages to me makes me worry. It's not that I don't think it's necessarily true in some cases. I'm not an all or nothing, but it really worries me because I don't think you can do the work we're doing here without doing all of those things at any given time, right? So no, I don't. And actually, the interesting thing is that Bloom's actually flipped those top two from time to time. So I'm not a fan of it. I'm going to show you something really quickly. Let's see if I can find this. I have found this before that I've used with students. Bloom's taxonomy as a circle. Let's see if I can find this. I don't think we ought to be teaching, we're doing 1, 2, 3, 4. And I understand your point. I don't think that's how we, oopsie, can't reach this page. Okay, hold on a minute here. Let's just look at it from here. I know you can't read this. You don't need to read what's in here. This is Bloom's taxonomy here, but it is set up more as this is an AI overview. Remember, we have to be very careful, but AI can give us and then I would use a source and go to that source. Don't ever just trust AI willy-nilly, but in this case, it's a way to visualize and represent the cyclical nature of learning, right? Learning is not lockstep. We don't just, okay, recall. Okay, I'm ready to do now comprehension. Now I'm ready to do. That's not how we learn. That's just not how we are. We're not lockstep. So it is about moving from basic understanding to higher order, but it actually is we're always in and out of all of these kinds of things. And so we're moving in and out of maybe evaluating. Even when we're asking these questions right now, we're trying to understand, but we're also evaluating. When I have you recite back to me, that's basic recall. There's no such thing as doing one thing at a time. So I would tend to shift my thinking on that. What I tell students is if they're building Bloom's in, go ahead and make sure you've got, I wouldn't say make a lesson that's just K1 or just K2. I would say make sure you've got a few different things going on. Now, it depends on the subject. If you're teaching beginning level math, you better know your basic mathematical functions before you move on. Having said that, even knowing 1 + 1 is 2, you still have to have some concept of properties of things, right? Like we tell kids to use their fingers, tell them to use little blocks, right? Even in a basic, we're not just memorizing 1 + 1 is 2. I had a son who came to me at 12 and he knew his multiplication tables, but he only knew them in order. And he could say 4 × 3, 4 × 4, 4 × 5, 4 × 6. And I'd say, well, what's 4 × 4? And he'd say, I don't know, that's out of order. And I'd say, yeah, but what is 4 × 4? What is 4? And then you have it 4 times. He's like, what are you talking about? He can memorize, but he has no concept. So we worked a lot. In math, when you learn slope, right? The formulas for slope. So he's very stuck, what is slope? And he was an English language learner as well. So he's a runner. I said, do you ever run up a hill? Yes. Do you ever run down a hill? Yes. Then you know what slope is, right? Slope is your amount is it sometimes harder to get up a hill? Is it sometimes easier? Yes. Then you know slope. That's a word you know, okay? So what I'm saying is he can memorize slope, y = mx + b. We can learn a formula, but it's more important to know what does that mean? Why? what is mx plus b? And I can sit to take a test. It's like if all I've done is memorize, I won't do very well on that test. So I would say mix it up. Find a circle for Bloom's and do it that way instead. So when I tell students, I say, make sure you've got a mix, but also if it doesn't make sense for that lesson, back yourself out if you need to. Yeah.
So I actually had a hard time figuring this out when I was on the
Yeah.
syllabus board because I had teammates coming from engineering background.
Right.
They go from A to Z in an order. And I'm from design field. I might be at step 6.
Exactly. Yeah, I'm more like that. Yeah, I'm much more like that. I mean, and again, everybody has their personal thing. And a field may also, a discipline may actually set that criteria a little bit. I think mathematically you build on, you're building on, but even so, you're learning concepts. I don't think a teacher would teach 3 plus 5 if you didn't have some sense of what 3 is, what sense of what 5 is, or even when we get to dividing, I have 15 pieces of candy and I have 5 students. Like, what does it mean to divide? Otherwise, it just is nothing. It doesn't mean anything. So I do, and that's higher order thinking, right? It's trying to say, okay, now I'm giving you 15 pieces of candy. You've got to divide it amongst you. How will you do it? And watch how people figure that out. That's higher level thinking. That's a lot of higher level thinking. When a child uses that error of ED for bringed, I bringed you some flowers, that is higher level thinking at a very high degree. That is creating a whole new word that doesn't exist. I mean, that's a pretty brilliant creation, right? That's why I just am always astounded by error, because very often it comes out of those higher level thinking. Yeah. Okay, let's do our Kahoot, shall we? Now, I've got to tell you something. This is not water. This is candy. I scrounged up what I hope is enough. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. I think I have enough in here for one apiece, and I don't think they're going to melt all over you today because we put it in the refrigerator. And I don't think they're going to melt. All right, so we have a solution. So I'm learning, right? I'm using my higher level on Bloom's taxonomy. Well, yeah, there we go. Okay, so we'll see how we do. It's just your basic. It's just those little Easter eggs again. You only get. I'm sorry, I only have enough for one apiece, I think. It's in there. Okay, live and learn. All right, are we ready? All right, now we're doing it individually. We're into individual mode. Are we off? Okay, we will stop with our taping. And thank you all for being here online or otherwise.